I guess good afternoon and good morning, perhaps, for some of the people that have tuned into this. As Steve mentioned, my name is Rob Fulcher. I've spent the last 20 years or so within the compliance and risk space with a key focus on GRC, governance, risk and compliance, and more recently and specifically regulatory intelligence and regulatory change. Prior to Cube, I spent about 15 years at Thomson Reuters. In fact, Greg, I saw you had CompliNet on your timeline, so I had a few years at CompliNet before that was acquired by Thomson Reuters. But in 2018, I started to look for the next business or the next technology that could help elevate compliance organisations to a more automated and efficient manner of managing regulatory change and regulatory monitoring, and that's when I stumbled across Cube. So for those who aren't familiar with Cube, Cube is a dynamic RegTech that specialises in converting regulatory content into regulatory intelligence and relieving that kind of that burden, that headache of regulatory monitoring, mapping and change. As Steve mentioned, I'm here to talk about the challenges related to first generation solutions. And how those challenges are kind of being addressed by RegTechs in the market at the moment. But first, I just thought I would set just a little bit of context before we move on to the slides and the pitfalls of those modern solutions. So first of all, past, present and future climate. I think without kind of labouring the point, everyone appreciates that post 2008, the financial crash, an awful lot changed for compliance. All of a sudden we saw an enormous amount of regulatory change coming through, and increased scrutiny from firms, regulators, and obviously increased fines as well. So as a result, financial services firms reacted. They invested hugely within compliance, resources, personnel, budget and spend, and I think that aligned well to the increased workload, of course. And without going through that timeline from 2008 to today, in recent years, I think what we're actually seeing is a scaling back in terms of personnel and some of the investment, or at least expectation around scaling back, and that is in spite of regulatory change. I'm based over here in the US, so regardless of current administration, but regulatory change still remains very, very high. At Cube, we monitor over 50,000 regulatory change pieces, both pending and proposed, as well as effective changes. Also, those fines, as Greg just mentioned as well, fines remain at an all-time high as well. So in short, compliance is being asked to do more for less, with less available to them, which obviously opens the door to RegTechs to come in and help them address that particular problem. And also, if we just look at the current climate, again, what this pandemic has brought about, what we've seen at Cube and what we expect to continue to see is a heightened focus and attention from the regulators on some of these topics that Sarah mentioned as well, that have come about as a result of what this new working environment where everyone's working more remotely. So topics like financial crime and cyber and privacy and business continuity. So new regulations coming through there. Secondly, what do I mean by legacy or first generation solutions? Well, I absolutely mean pre-RegTech. So solutions that aren't currently deploying artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing to help improve accuracy and efficiency across reg monitoring and reg change. And a lot of these solutions, these first generation solutions, would have existed pre-financial crash, actually, such as legacy GRCs, and they simply weren't designed in anticipation of the volume and velocity of regulatory change that we've seen over the last 12 years. So that brings about its own challenges. So they're the types of solutions, without obviously naming any names, that I'm referring to when I'm referring to traditional legacy or first generation solutions. And lastly, a notable mention, if this was a couple of years ago, I may I may have included this in the following slides, which is that kind of manual approach to regulatory change and regulatory monitoring. But I think we're actually at a point in time, and hopefully my friends on this call would agree with me, that that practitioners and regulators are kind of coming together in agreement now that that old approach of throwing people and at the problem and trying to manage, in this instance, in CUBE's instance, regulatory change through a collection of different spreadsheets, that's no longer seen as a solution. Certainly not a long-term sustainable solution either. Okay, so moving on. So this is what I'm calling the pitfalls of legacy solutions in today's climate, and starting with regulatory gaps. What I mean by regulatory gaps, so legacy content providers and solutions, they've rarely been able to present or evidence a fully comprehensive global inventory of regulations. And that means in turn, of course, that firms are left with holes or gaps in the inventories which they are taking from those legacy providers, which of course in turn leaves them very exposed to their regulators. And actually at CUBE, we're seeing a trend across the globe, very much so in North America, but certainly across the globe, where the key financial services regulators are asking firms to evidence that they have a full understanding of the complete regulatory obligations across their businesses. And what I mean by that is, can they evidence to them a complete and comprehensive inventory of all applicable laws and regulations that apply to their businesses? So that's an awful lot to do if you're a tier 1 global bank operating in a number of different jurisdictions. And the traditional approach to trying to solve that with these legacy solutions is sometimes to go out and try and plug the gaps through multiple different solution providers, or to go out to law firms, or to again throw people at the problem. But all of those approaches bring about inconsistencies in data, as well as uncertainty of completeness, and of course all with great expense. The second pitfall is data errors. And as I mentioned earlier, most first generation solutions weren't designed to manage the complexity of post-financial crash regulations. And traditional content providers, because of aging technologies, they've been unable to convert regulatory content that you can access via a regulated website or the web. They've been unable to convert that into regulatory intelligence. So the result is a lot of erroneous or frequently duplicated data that appears in firms' first-gen reg change solutions. And of course, that's a problem. But I'd say the biggest problem and the biggest challenge in legacy solutions, as far as data is concerned, is overwhelming compliance and business and policy and control owners within the business with data that just isn't delivered at a right level of granularity. It's delivered at too high a level. So this actually means that a first generation solution is it's actually counterproductive for the very purpose it was brought in to serve. It actually means that compliance and business owners are actually sifting through a lot of unnecessary noise in order to determine applicability. Outsource mapping, again, just looking at the space that CUBE plays in, which is regulatory change management, regulatory intelligence. This is probably one of the most overlooked aspects of a delivery of such a solution, and it's the activity of mapping regulations to a firm's internal structure or internal risk taxonomies or policies or controls. That's when we look at the traditional sense, when we look at those legacy solutions, that's a very time consuming and labor intensive exercise. And so very often it's outsourced to firms, be they legal firms or consulting firms, to undertake those activities, which obviously comes at a huge cost to the business. Next is poor interoperability. Again, first gen GRC platforms were historically designed to cater for general governance, risk and compliance functions, as opposed to specifically understanding the complex requirements of regulatory change. So as a result, data's often not leveraged in an efficient way across the organization. And that means that whether it's intended or not, of course, it's largely not intended, but it creates fragmentation across groups within an organization. And ultimately, it duplicates efforts, whether that's obtaining content or dissecting content in a way that's relevant to any one group and the articles that they own. Last, I say last. There's many I can list, but I've gone with the top 5 here, which is efficient and costly. Sorry, inefficient and costly, because of some of the reasons which I've stated above here, with the regulatory gaps, data errors, etc. There's often a very kind of poor user experience on the first generation solutions. We deal with this all the time when we're talking with our customers, that these solutions are often deployed at an enterprise level, but it doesn't have the uptake. It hasn't been embraced at a true enterprise level. And very, very often, again, it means that these firms end up cobbling together different solutions to try and cater for different areas that aren't using a solution at an enterprise level, creating a lot of inefficiencies and obviously a lot of cost that comes along with it. So moving across to addressing those pitfalls with RegTech solutions. If I look first of all at regulatory gaps, and I do obviously have a focus here on Q, but I'll try and keep this more generically within this space. But in 2020, in fact, this has been the case really since 2015, RegTechs now have the ability to deploy AI, machine learning, natural language processing, and spidering technologies as well to capture a much wider spectrum of financial services regulation, but do it much faster as well, and ultimately get to the point that they have a fully comprehensive global inventory of content and can in turn deliver a global inventory of relevant content to their customers. At Cube, we currently monitor over 2,000 issuing bodies. I mentioned earlier that on average, we're looking at over 50,000 different regulatory changes that come out of those 2,000 issuing bodies. But within those bodies, we've got some 10 million plus individual regulatory statements, and that spans over 180 different countries and 60 different languages. So it ensures that we've got watertight tracking of regulations, and this just wouldn't have been possible before the dawn of RegTechs and that ability to kind of go much broader, much faster. Next, looking at data errors, if we look at tailored relevant results, again, because of these modern technologies that RegTechs are able to deploy, we've got an ability to deliver regulatory content in a much more meaningful and accurate and structured way. So at Cube, as an example, we automatically deconstruct and classify all regulatory content that we're ingesting, and that's coming in from a variety of different sources. So we're normalizing it, deconstructing it and classifying it so that we can deliver relevant materials to our clients at a level of granularity that improves efficiencies and drastically reduces room for error. Was that the bell I just heard, Steve?
It was, Rob, yeah.
All right, okay. Outsourced mapping, so automated mapping. For me, this is probably the biggest item that any one firm can think about when they're looking at deploying a reg change solution, because the expense of going out to services firms to help with this mapping is so significant. With RegTech, they're actually able to automate the process by aligning the classified content that they have with a firm's internal taxonomies. Cube has some differentiators in this space which can drastically save time and effort, and as I say, automate that process. Poor interoperability, this is a must as well in today's world. Having an open API that allows the data to freely, securely, but freely and seamlessly move from a reg change solution into the rest of the organization so that data can be used across that organization. So fragmentation goes and you're actually able to get the most value out of data as you look at business owners, etc. And lastly, Steve, I'll keep this one short. Efficient and costly. So the answer to that is automated and efficient. And hopefully from what I've shared and actually what my friends prior to this have shared on their presentations, it should be kind of fairly obvious that with RegTechs, we're greatly able to improve the previous kind of inefficiencies that those first generation legacy solutions brought about by introducing a much more automated, much more efficient way of working across an organization, which of course in turn improves those operational and commercial efficiencies.